So I keep chucking along on this five greatest players in NFL team history by today looking at the Cincinnati Bengals. Oh, those woeful bungles, as they were called for many years, in particular in the 1990s, because there were some bad, very lean times in that organization's history. But to be fair to the Cincinnati Bengals organization that's been around since the mid to late 1960s, it hasn't always been bad. They made two Super Bowl appearances in the 80s. You could say sometimes they just had the unfortunate luck of running up against Joe Montana and the San Francisco 49ers both times, especially that second time. You're talking about a team with Super Bowl 23 that literally came about 30 something seconds away from winning a Super Bowl championship. Look at the Bengals now. They've made the playoffs 3 straight years. They won the AFC North in 2013. This is an organization that has some good history along with a lot of bad. Again, a team that's been to the Super Bowl more times than the Detroit Lions or the Cleveland Browns. Just think about that for a second, or the Arizona Cardinals. I mean, they've been to more Super Bowls in the past 25 years than the Kansas City Chiefs have for the past 40 years. It's been since the freaking end of the 1960s, since the last time the Kansas City Chiefs were in a Super Bowl. So I'm just saying that even though the Bengals have this stigma and they had this reputation for many years, they by no means have been the worst organization in football throughout their entire existence, by no stretch of the imagination. And they've had some decent players over the years. Ultimately, I'm looking for the five greatest Cincinnati Bengals in team history, but there are some other guys that deserve some mentioning here. I look at Ken Riley, one of the more underrated cornerbacks, in NFL history. I look at a guy like David Fulcher, Bob Johnson, the only player in organization's history to have his jersey retired, Bob Trumpy, Corey Dillon, Chris Collinsworth, James Brooks. There have been some good players that have donned the Bengal tiger stripe, if you will, over the years, but just not good enough to make this list. To me, there were five Bengals, again, that stood out above the rest and are the five greatest players in the history of the organization. At number five, I've got Willie Anderson, the 10th overall selection in the 1996 NFL Draft out of Auburn, who went on to really be one of the few bright spots for many years with the Cincinnati Bengals. In his 12 seasons in Cincinnati, he was a four-time Pro Bowler, a three-time first-team All-Pro, and I think relatively unanimously viewed as, if not the best, very close to the best right tackle in all of the National Football League. If he had played as a part of a lot of better teams, if he had played for teams that maybe won a Super Bowl, people would think of Willie Anderson in a much higher regard than what they actually do. He's sadly a very forgotten player. Number four, Boomer Esiason, the 38th overall selection in the second round out of Maryland in the 1984 NFL Draft. He had some very big shoes to fill trying to replace Bengals legend and the greatest quarterback in that organization's history, Ken Anderson. And to be fair to Boomer Esiason, he did a pretty good job. In his total of 10 seasons with the Cincinnati Bengals, he was a four-time Pro Bowler, a one-time first-team All-Pro, the NFL's most valuable player in the 1988 season when he led the Bengals to Super Bowl 23, where again they came this close to winning a Super Bowl championship. Boomer Esiason was a solid quarterback. Wasn't an all-time great, not a Hall of Fame player, but definitely not a slouch. And I think sometimes, people look at him as how corny and hokey he's been over the years in the broadcast booth and on the pregame shows and halftime shows and postgame shows, what have you. But don't get it twisted. Boomer Esiason was a very good NFL starting quarterback and a very good football player for over a decade. He really, truly was. And I think, again, a player that doesn't get the respect and credit that he deserves. Number three, I look at Chad Johnson, the 36th overall selection out of Oregon State in the 2001 NFL Draft. Throughout that entire decade of the 2000s, Chad Johnson was really the player I think that made people actually care about the Cincinnati Bengals again. That actually helped bring them back to respectability, to where they were actually viewed as a legitimate NFL franchise. He was a six-time Pro Bowler, a two-time first-team All-Pro. He had 7 seasons as a Bengal during his 10 years there with 1,000-plus receiving yards. A guy that'll be viewed as a borderline Hall of Famer now that his career is over in the NFL. A guy, again, like I said, he really brought some star power, some sex appeal, some sizzle, some ability and savvy as a self promoter, and as a result, promoting the Cincinnati Bengals as well during his 10 seasons for the organization. And I think he deserves a lot of credit for that. Like I said, the Bengals as an organization needed some life, and Chad Johnson during his decade there in the 2000s provided a lot of that life for the organization. Now, some of you might sit there and say, why is he only number three? Why isn't he at least number two? Well, I'm sorry, but number two to me is Ken Anderson, the 67th overall selection in the third round out of Augustana in the 1971 NFL draft. When you look at Ken Anderson, I think this is one of the more criminally underrated players in the history of the National Football League, a guy that I think belongs on any list of the 10 or 15 greatest players not in the Pro Football Hall of Fame that should be. A four-time Pro Bowler, a one-time first-team All-Pro, and again, a great quarterback at a time where you had a lot of great quarterbacks in the league like Staubach and Bradshaw and Dan Fouts. You know, you could sit there and say, well, why didn't he make more Pro Bowls or first-team All-Pro appearances? Look at the level of competition he had at the position at that time. That doesn't necessarily mean that he wasn't a great player himself. You know, he was a two-time league leader in passing yards, a three-time league leader in completion percentage. He led the Bengals to a Super Bowl. They were the 1981 AFC champions. He was the 1981 NFL Most Valuable Player, and still to this day, even though it's been almost 30 years since Ken Anderson was a starting quarterback for the Cincinnati Bengals, and even after a Boomer Esiason and a Carson Palmer, and even now an Andy Dalton, I guess you'd say, assuming he'll be there for years. Ken Anderson still to this day is the franchise's career all-time leader in passing yards and touchdowns. I think it's a joke and a shame that his jersey hasn't been retired by the organization. I think it's a joke and a shame, frankly, that he slipped through the cracks so much and still hasn't found his rightful place in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Ken Anderson was a damn good quarterback. I would argue maybe a great quarterback during a time where the passing game was starting to become more important in this, especially in the 70s. But not every team valued it as much. Anderson was one of the best consistently over the course of an entire decade, and he had some big shoes to fill too. Because the Bengals back in the late '60s had a quarterback by the name of Greg Cook that looked like he was going to be a world beater, that had the skill sets and the ability to be a Pro Football Hall of Famer and lead the Bengals to championships and all of this. And then he fucked up his shoulder at the end of his rookie year, and he was never the same. And Ken Anderson eventually came in and frankly made Bengals fans in the NFL forget all about Greg Cook and what could have been. Ken Anderson was what ended up being, and it was good for his 16 seasons in Cincinnati. But I think beyond question, the number one Cincinnati Bengal of all time, and this truly is not even close, is the guy that I feel is the greatest left tackle in the history of the NFL. A guy that is the only Bengals player who played primarily with the Bengals throughout his whole career to be inducted in Canton in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And of course, I'm talking about Anthony Munoz, the third overall selection out of USC in the 1980 NFL Draft. The phenomenal thing about Anthony Munoz was this is a guy I think that played maybe a total of 15 or 16 games at USC. And, Forrest Gregg worked him out and basically said, you know what, I think we found our guy. We're going to take him. And all Anthony Munoz ended up becoming was the prototype that every left tackle here on going forward is ultimately measured against. He became the best offensive lineman in his era, unless you argue maybe a John Hanna, but I would say Munoz might even have been better because he played at a more premier position of left tackle. You just didn't beat Anthony Munoz, 11-time Pro Bowler, a 9-time first-team All-Pro, a part of two AFC championship teams in 1981 and 1988. This was a guy that was, the gold standard of offensive linemen, the gold standard in particular of left tackles. He was a member of the 1980s NFL All-Decade team, a member of the 75th anniversary NFL All-Decade team, a first ballot Hall of Famer in 1998, and like I said, the only Cincinnati Bengal player to have a bust in Canton. And that, to me, beyond question, makes Anthony Munoz the greatest Cincinnati Bengal of all time. Let me know what you think of my list down below. If you agree with it, if you disagree with it, what your list might be of the 5 greatest Cincinnati Bengals of all time. Next up, I will be talking about the Cleveland Browns. Oh, goody.